Hi everybody, I have some injury prevention tips for you today, and specifically around hip injuries. So we see a lot of people in clinic who end up with a whole variety of hip injuries, but many of them could have been prevented if they had known these couple of quick tips. So a lot of the time active individuals use their hips in hip flexion ranges, and a hip flexion range is the range your hip moves into when you're in a seated position or when you're going into a squat. And the reason for this is mostly to do with our activities of daily living and the types of activities that people who are quite active in their life do. So if you think about it, you may fall into these categories as well. If you spend a lot of time sitting, if you do training that involves seated type positions, so this could be things like spin or cycle sessions, whether that be a class or actually on the road on a bike. If you do a lot of squat based training, you're ending up in those hip flexion ranges quite a lot. Also, many of the step up type classes or even bounce type classes tend to promote that hip flexion range. And while many of these activities are fantastic, they can be great for cardiovascular fitness, they can be great for strength and endurance in your legs, a lot of them promote that hip flexion range of motion. So my first hack for you, if you're looking to prevent hip injuries and you fall into this category of spending a lot of time in hip flexion, is to start to work on some hip extension based activities. Now, the easiest way to do this is to just add lunges to your program. So if you're already doing squats at the gym, make sure you don't just favor squats, make sure you do lunges as well. If you do a lot of bike type riding, fantastic, make sure you throw some maybe lunges as a warm up to some of the stuff you do on the bike, whether that be in cycle or on the road. And if you're more of a sedentary based sitting person, you do a lot of driving or sitting at work, then adding some lunges, just jumping up in the middle of the day and doing a couple of sets of walking lunges either up and down the office or around the house, goes a huge way to help prevent some of those hip flexion based injuries. So that's my first hack for you in injury prevention, specifically around hips. Add some hip extension work, and the easiest way to do that is to add lunges. My second one is to start to be aware of your hip placement as it moves through flexion and extension. And what I mean by that is make sure the ball and socket joint of your hip is aligning itself so that as you go back into hip flexion or a squat based activity, that the ball rolls into the back of the hip socket. And the easiest way to check that you're doing this correctly or to start practicing this alignment in your hip is to do something called a hip hinge. If you haven't seen my previous video on that, you can check it out. It'll be linked over here or linked below, and that should give you a bit of a starting place to start to learn how to hip hinge and align your ball and socket joint appropriately. So that's my second hack. First one is chuck some lunges into your routine. Second one is make sure you align your hip properly, and to do that you can use a hip hinge. And my final one is to try and get some release-based work done around your hip. So the hip joint is actually one of the most mobile joints in the body, although you wouldn't know that sometimes talking to people who have self-confessed terrible hamstring length or really bad adductor range, and they just don't use those ranges of their hip. So a lot of the time it's not that they're stiff and they're going to be stiff forever, it's just the type of movement that they do on a day-to-day, week-to-week, year-to-year based program really doesn't involve big ranges of hip mobility. So my last hack for you in terms of trying to prevent hip injuries is to start to look at the ranges of motion you're using when you're doing your hip-based work. And my favorite way to really start to improve the range of motion of your hips is to throw some Pilates-based exercises in there. Things like reformer feet in straps, which we all love, is a fantastic way to start opening up the ranges of your hip. So too are a bunch of the stretches you can do on the ladder barrel in the Pilates studio. Things like feet in springs, a lot of the wonder chair work like backward step down and sideways step down, they're all fantastic for really opening up those or unlocking those ranges of your hip that we just tend not to use in day-to-day movements. So I hope that was helpful. If you're looking to prevent long-term injury in your hips, those 3 tips are my top for being able to stop hip injuries. First of all, add some hip extension based work. Easiest way to do that is with a lunge. Second of all, make sure you're thinking about hip hinging and aligning your hip, the ball ball and socket joint appropriately. And finally, make sure you use all different ranges of motions of your hip. And a nice way to do that is in the Pilates studio. Okay, that's all from me. If you've got questions or comments, as always, guys, you can post them down below. And if you need some more personalized, feedback, or you want to talk to someone about something specific in your own body, easiest thing to do is to give the girls a call. We've got 3 studios in Sydney, Caringbah, Helston Park and Alexandria, and we've got a whole team of highly qualified physiotherapists and Pilates instructors who would be more than happy to chat to you and have a look at your hips and see if we can find out what might be holding you back. All right, that's all from me. Bye.